Good afternoon. So my name is Colin Spence. I am accompanied by my colleague Lindsay Robbs, LPN, in the back. So we are from Quality Medical Research. We are a subsidiary of Digestive and Liver Health Specialists. I'm here to talk to you today about clinical trials, just a brief summary of what they are, their importance, and how that pertains to advances in the treatment of liver disease.
Let me take that back.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so jumping right into it. So since antiquity, human beings have leveraged pharmacology to try to or cure what ails us. Our methodologies have advanced a long way from, what was essentially using plants and herbs and things like that to now where we are using more sophisticated means like monoclonal antibody therapy. That handsome guy is Mithridates. He was the king of Parthia in ancient times, and he basically implemented his own clinical trials by just giving, basically random herbs and plants and things like that to people to see what kind of response it elicited. That was before things like ethics really existed, because they weren't always, it wasn't always a consensual thing. And for centuries, this is a very brief history, but we had all sorts of remedies and cures that were touted to basically deal with a whole bunch of maladies for centuries. There wasn't a lot of oversight, something that was championed by early physicians and charlatans alike. Notably in this country, things started to change when we had the rise of what was known as snake oil medicine in the 19th century, the 1800s. So this was basically where people were pitching any kind of medication they came up with in towns, cities, what have you. This was back in the day when you would see signs for like Dr. Gillespie's miracle elixir cures hemorrhoids, balding, leprosy, diarrhea, and then it would just be some water with vinegar in it. So around 1906 is when public outcry prompted the U.S. government to pass what was called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Some of you might know this coincided with the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, where he did kind of an expose on the unsanitary conditions in like meat packing factories and stuff. That was like the food component of the Pure Food and Drug Act. That act didn't really do anything about efficacy. It was all about listing the ingredients in your new drug and making sure there weren't adulterants or, toxic substances that were injurious to health, right? So it was subsequently followed by the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is something we still have to abide by today. That act was basically looking, again, more at just kind of safety and basically toxicity of drugs, not a whole lot at efficacy. So this is just a brief timeline. Like we've already discussed, 1906, the Pure Drug and Food Act is passed. 1930, the FDA is established, which I am calling just kind of a finished product because it had a lot of predecessors in terms of organizations that were stewards of public health. And then 8 years later, we had the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act passed in Congress. Again, we're getting a little bit closer here, but we're not really looking at efficacy yet. We're not looking at how well these drugs work that are being promoted. 1944, we had the clinical investigation program that was established. That is how there was a formalized system of rules for clinical trials and how we were going to do them. It was a collaboration between government, industry, and manufacturers on like, okay, so if we're going to do this as a formalized system, like what needs to be involved? 1962 is the Kefauver-Harris amendments. So this is where we actually start looking at efficacy now. So we care about how well the drug does its purported job in treating an illness. It was also the birth of kind of randomized controlled trials being the gold standard by which we test drugs. Randomized, of course, for people who don't know, is just basically patients or subjects get put into a treatment arm, one or the other. It's random, and controlled trials usually involve placebos. 1974, National Research Act is enacted, and that's where we get our IRB, Institutional Review Board, and that basically, they review all of the proposed protocols by drug manufacturers, how they want to test their new drug. It has to go through the IRB. Okay, so there's just a general statement by the FDA. Clinical trials are research studies in which people volunteer to help find answers to specific health questions. When carefully conducted, they are the safest and fastest way to find new treatments and ways to improve health. So every clinical trial is comprised of a few shared basic components. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but so there's the protocol, which is the detailed plan of how the clinical trial is going to go, basically what kinds of testing is involved, the schedule of events, as it's known as, or the timeline of the trial, how side effects and adverse effects are handled with patients, and then the how and when we are going to administer the study drug. Eligibility criteria, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. That's just seeing if patients qualify for a study. More times than not, typically it's just based on medical history and what drugs the patients are on. It can entail some other things like their BMI, their age, some demographic info like that, or things that might confound the study results. So for instance, like a gastroparesis study, if somebody has a gastric stimulator, well, it's hard to know what the drug is doing versus something that's already helping their gastroparesis. So those patients would be excluded, for example. Informed consent, that's just making sure the patient has adequate information about the study and everything that it entails, and adequate time is given to confirm understanding with the patient. This is all going towards study ethics and making sure that there aren't any surprises for the subjects. No process or no part of the trial can proceed without their consent, not even the screening and going over medical history. So some other prerequisite stuff, you've got the patient screenings where we give them a battery of tests such as physical exams, laboratory tests, ECG, x-rays, and other diagnostic imaging procedures. Study visits and endpoints, we'll repeat some of those things at every study visit. And then endpoints are just in a study, those are the things we're trying to answer, right? So that is basically looking at something that the drug is going to fix and how we can quantify that. In some of our liver studies, it is looking at percent reduction of liver fat, and that we use things like MRI and things like that to assess that. Like if there was a cardiovascular drug study, it's looking at like time until an event like a stroke or a heart attack, which was going to happen anyway, but how long can it be prolonged by the agent that's being tested? And then we do have audits and monitoring, because we are subject to audits by not just the study monitor, who is the liaison between us and the pharmaceutical company, but the FDA as well. So we've got the phases broken down here of a clinical trial. So phase 1, small number of patients, anywhere from 20 to 100. We're just looking at safety. We're just looking at where is the safe dose that's tolerated in patients, right? Phase 2, now we're looking more at efficacy. We've gone from 100 to several hundreds of subjects. Phase 3, that is going to be enhanced exploration of efficacy. Now we are comparing the study drug against other standard treatments that are already on the market, or placebo, or what have you. This is in the thousands of subjects. And then there's phase 4, which is post-market surveillance. So that is when the drug has already been approved, it's already on the market, and we're trying to get a sense of what might have been missed in terms of unexpected side effects, things like that. Usually it is predicated on things like surveys and reporting systems with the FDA. A good example would be VAERS, if anybody's heard of it, which stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, where vaccines that hit the market, if anybody has any sort of side effect, they report to VAERS, and then if enough statistically gets compiled, that becomes part of the literature. All right, so why do we have clinical trials? There's, a myriad of reasons. We have new drugs sometimes for completely undertreated conditions that are rare. This is like the orphan drug program with the FDA, where they incentivize manufacturers through tax breaks or certain grants for funding to come up with drugs that treat rare and undertreated diseases. So they help us in that way. And then there are sometimes new drugs for an indication where we already have pharmacological treatments for this disease, but they have things that can be improved upon, such as efficacy, their side effect profile, or ease of administration. An example of that would be when it comes to, let's say, ulcerative colitis. A lot of the therapies were initially intravenous. Then you have to go to a hospital and get an infusion, but then we have sub-Q injections like Humira, where you can do it at home, right? So we're just kind of making things easier on the patients. And then, another one would be for a while, warfarin was king of anticoagulants, right? But you had dietary issues. You can only eat a certain amount of leafy greens in a week. It was notoriously hard to dose. An INR shoots up and you have to decrease by a milligram or two and see what happens and whatever. But now we have Eliquis, Xarelto, things like that don't have those problems. So we have clinical trials to thank for that. So currently drugs that are approved, but to study new uses for them. We have a drug that treats multiple sclerosis, has done very well, but now we're trying to see if it works for UC as an example. And then explore the use of a therapy in new patient populations. I mean, so like if we have a drug that treats something in adults, there might be a pretty considerable epidemiology in like children. Can we find out at a significantly lower dose, can it work in children as well? So in general, they answer a lot of important questions and help fulfill unmet needs in the medical treatment of serious conditions. Similarly, there are many reasons why patients want to participate in clinical trials. So a lot of them is because they've tried everything else and thrown everything in the kitchen sink at a problem and nothing seems to be working. Some patients might have a therapy that works and they don't have access to it for various reasons, whether it is kind of financially out of their stratosphere, like expensive biologics for certain issues, or their plan doesn't cover it or something like that. And then patients who have socioeconomic challenges and are uninsured and stuff, that it helps those patients as well. Another thing that's notable is also patients get regular checkups in a clinical trial because we're taking blood work regularly, and this is basically a way that they feel more empowered and more like, in the conversation about their own health, and it doesn't cost them anything. So this is our clinic, Quality Medical Research. We are, like I said, a subsidiary of Digestive and Liver Health Specialists. So it is the office of Dr. Stephanie Pointer and Dr. Sarah Sharma are our principal investigators. So any clinical trial has to have a PI, and they are always a physician. That's us up there. Not a terrible looking group, if I do say so myself, but this is our clinic. Basically our physicians will see patients for whatever indication that is GI related. And when they have patients who are refractory to standard treatments or have some other complicated issue, they refer those patients to us. We then subsequently screen them, and then we approach them about study participation is how that works. So studies that are currently enrolling, these are the indications for which we have studies. Erosive esophagitis. So we have a new medication that basically works to suppress acid secretion in the stomach and also promote esophageal healing. That medication is something that a lot of patients, they're more than receptive to be in those studies because they have thrown everything at their GERD and nothing seems to be working. They've run the gamut from everything OTC to otherwise. Gastroparesis, we have a medication that treats the nausea that is a big sequelae of gastroparesis. And this is a good example of things that are already approved, but they have not a great side effect profile because there is a drug obviously out there. It's called Reglan, metoclopramide, helps with gastric motility. But because it blocks dopamine is how it works, it causes movement disorders and tardive dyskinesia. So it's not great. It has its issues. So this is something that does not really cause the same issues, and there's the impetus there. So weight loss, we have 2 injectable medications that we are now testing in conjunction with diet and exercise. Because when it comes to obesity and overweight, it's usually multifactorial is a problem. Therefore, the approach has to be holistic in how we treat it, right? And this disease, or this study rather, we have like an ambulatory blood pressure monitor they wear for like 24 hours that takes just kind of diurnal like blood pressure patterns, and there's a little wristwatch thing that tracks movement. So pretty cool stuff. NASH liver disease. So we have 4 studies that are looking at NASH treatments right now, which is significant because up until very recently, there was not a pharmacological treatment for NASH. It was primarily indirectly through attenuating their comorbidities, and we had someone talk extensively just now about exercise and diet and how important that is. But now we might have some pharmacological options. So 4 on just NASH without cirrhosis, then we do have a study that looks at patients with NASH who have developed cirrhosis. So let's talk about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it is something, unfortunately, that is on the rise, is the incidence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So basically just when the liver is infiltrated by fat tissue. It's a lot of livers can have fat content, but it's when you go over that 5% by weight liver is when you start to enter the realm of fatty liver disease. And it's a progressive disease because you can start with non-alcoholic fatty liver, which in the literature has been described as like benign. I don't know, you could argue it's not benign because it can certainly get much worse, but relatively few symptoms associated with it. And you can then, if it isn't treated or addressed properly, it can progress to NASH because that is where now you have inflammation, right? With NASH comes some other things as well. You can have what's called ballooning and then fibrosis. In fact, that is one of the ways we categorize NASH as fibrosis. There's F0, F1, there's all the way to F4, which is cirrhotic. And then, we have some other pathogenic features there. So, diagnostically speaking, just plain fatty liver disease can be diagnosed non-invasively by things like CT scan, ultrasound, MRI. The gold standard for NASH diagnosis is liver biopsy. And for non-alcoholic, just fatty liver, not NASH, the gold standard is biopsy too, but we just have more non-invasive means of doing that. So not everybody who has fatty liver disease has NASH. That's important to note. There are a number of risk factors for progressing to NASH. So it's things like if you have features of metabolic syndrome like high cholesterol, not well-managed diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and then there's some other things too like age over 60 and then elevated liver enzymes, so your transaminases, ALT, AST, that kind of thing. So risk factors, again, I've already kind of gone over that: obesity or overweight, high cholesterol, triglycerides, and diabetes. Symptoms, so they can be relatively mild, just weakness, fatigue, and just kind of some pain in what's called your right upper quadrant, just like right here where your liver is. It can certainly get worse. The other symptoms are basically when it's already progressed to cirrhosis, when you have fluid retention, the itchiness, the fluid retention being ascites, confusion, and jaundice, right, turning yellow. Prevention, so I'm not going to belabor the point because someone's already covered this pretty extensively. So weight reduction by about 7 to 10%, the 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity exercise, however they want to divide that up per day. Balanced diet with plenty of nuts, grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, which are all things that comprise the Mediterranean diet. There have been a lot of studies in Europe that have shown that the Mediterranean diet's pretty effective at reducing, lipids in the liver. And then avoidance of alcohol consumption. Alcohol does not cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, obviously, but it can certainly speed up the progression from fatty liver to NASH. So new innovations for NASH treatment. So far, the only real means of treating NASH have not been pharmacological, like we've discussed here. So usually by attenuating the other comorbidities and trying to implement therapeutic lifestyle changes. The new pharmacological agents that are being looked at right now basically work by, and this is a little reductive, but they basically work by mimicking naturally occurring or endogenous chemicals in the body that basically spur the breakdown of fats in the liver. So one agent that we're working with is a stimulant at thyroid hormone receptors, because the thyroid hormone system plays a big role in removing fat from the liver and fatty acid metabolism. Another drug is like a synthetic form of a peptide that does basically the same thing. So, and we assess basically how effective the drugs are via MRI and FibroScan being just a way to measure liver stiffness, just to see how effective these medications are, reducing fat content and fibrosis in liver tissue. So why is all of this important? Because NAFLD is a progressive disease, and right now it's one of the main causes of liver disease in the U.S. specifically. The incidence is somewhere around 24 to 25% of people with liver disease will have NAFLD. It is estimated that of those people, a fifth have NASH. So NASH is actually the second leading cause of liver transplantation in female adults, and it's projected by 2030 to be the leading cause of liver transplantation overall, which is a pretty staggering statistic. And so when NASH is not treated or controlled, it is allowed to progress. It can lead ultimately to cirrhosis and eventually hepatocellular carcinoma, which is, of course, cancerous. Let's see. Oh, there we go. And you can kind of see on the little infographic here, like the little backwards arrows from NASH and NAFL. That's to signify that, like, that is, once you get to NAFL or NASH, it's actually reversible if you implement the changes that you need to. It isn't until you develop cirrhosis that it's irreversible. And even then, you can hold basically the pathogenesis of it at bay if you're treated properly. But if not, it can, again, progress to HCC, which is also irreparable as a condition. So these new medications, they represent a promising step towards mitigating a disease that's not only growing in prevalence, but also has dire health consequences. So to recap, clinical trials are the product of a long and storied evolution on the path to making innovative new therapies available to the public while rigorously safeguarding its safety. They are subject to thorough oversight and regulations. They also share several key features in their designs that ensure reliable data gathering via sound scientific principle, as well as protection of their human participants. We have ongoing clinical trials, like I mentioned, at our clinic, one of them to treat the pervasive liver diseases, specifically NAFLD and NASH. And patients can be empowered to take control of their health and do what they can to make diet, lifestyle changes to control or even reverse NAFLD. So, and the advent of medications and their approval through that process of clinical trials basically has wide-ranging implications for quality of life and how well we can grapple with that disease in patients. So, and that's the end of that.